This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. You can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA, that's A-A-S-A, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. This is a really important organisation for animal studies. You can join today for a very reasonable price, and it's lower if you are a student, unwaged or precariously waged. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. This is a great collection of books about animal studies. Today, we're talking about a book that reflects repeatedly on what it means to relate to animals in the Anthropocene. It's apposite, therefore, that I mention the 2015 Animal Publics book, Animals in the Anthropocene, Critical Perspectives on Non-Human Futures, which offers very valuable reflections on those same questions. Also, a quick shout out to Elizabeth Usher, who provided the updated theme tune for Knowing Animals. To learn more about Elizabeth, visit veganthused.com. Now, today I'm very pleased to introduce you to a returning guest. Dr. Jeff Sebo is a clinical associate professor of environmental studies at New York University, where he's also an affiliated professor in bioethics, medical ethics, philosophy and law, as well as the director of the Animal Studies MA program and the Mind, Ethics and Policy program. He's also co-director of the university's Wild Animal Welfare program. He sits on the executive committee of the New York University Center for Environment and Animal Protection and is part of the advisory board for the Animals in Context book series at New York University Press, and regular listeners will know that I've mentioned this on Knowing Animals before. He's also the co-author or author of a number of books about animals, and today we're going to talk about one of them. That's his most recent book, which is Saving Animals, Saving Ourselves, Why Animals Matter for Pandemics, Climate Change and Other Catastrophes. This book was published by Oxford University Press in 2022. Welcome to the podcast, Jeff.
Thanks so much for having me.
So can you start by telling us what led to you writing this book?
Sure. So the book is about why animals matter for pandemics and climate change and other catastrophes, and why those catastrophes matter for animals. And I wish I could say that I took on this project because I understood how important and neglected this issue was, and I thought that I could make a difference talking about it. But actually, as with many things, I started working on the topic because of fortuitous coincidence, which is that I was asked to write a chapter on animals and climate change for a book on philosophy and climate change. And I was initially reluctant to do it because how many times can you write the same chapter about how animal agriculture contributes to climate change? But I decided to do it because I thought someone should do that in this book. And then the more I started working on the chapter, the more I started thinking that there are a lot of really important and neglected additional issues here, including the impacts that climate change is going to have on both captive and wild animal populations. And so I started working on a chapter that was both about how factory farming and animal agriculture contribute to climate change, but then also about how climate change will contribute to captive and wild animal suffering and death and biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. And then the more I started working on that, the more I realized this is a huge topic and it actually requires a book. So I arranged to write a book with Oxford University Press and I started working on that. And then, of course, we entered our current era where while I was working on this book, we saw animals suffering and dying in Amazon wildfires and the Australian bushfires and heat waves and coastal flooding all over the world. And then COVID-19 occurred and bird flu occurred. And we started to see animals suffering and dying because of disease outbreaks and disease-related cullings. And I realized that the issue is not only important, but it really encompasses global health and environmental issues and is quite timely because of the way that these disease outbreaks and fires and floods have been increasingly salient. And so I started writing the book for that reason. And then because of what has been happening over the past few years, I was able to directly address those issues through the book, which which was a good opportunity, but of course, an unfortunately tragic good opportunity.
So do you think that the COVID crisis, or perhaps even your experience of COVID, changed the contents of the arguments of the book in a large way?
I think that writing the book during that time certainly made it more personal and immediate. And it did also expand the scope of the book. I was always discussing how our treatment of animals in factory farming and deforestation and the wildlife trade contributes to global health and environmental threats like pandemics and climate change. But the fact that I was writing the book during COVID-19 motivated me to give those issues equal attention in the book. And likewise, I was always aware that these global health and environmental threats impact animals too. But again, what was happening to animals over the past few years persuaded me to give those types of impacts equal attention as well. So it definitely expanded the scope of the book, and it made some of the examples and case studies, I think, more concrete and immediate.
So let's start with that big, basic, and vitally important question. What does climate change and what do pandemics have to do with animals?
Yeah, so as I noted, there are really two kinds of effects here. One is that our treatment of animals in industries like factory farming, deforestation, and the wildlife trade contribute to these global threats. And then the other is that these global threats contribute to biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and individual animal suffering and death in many cases. And so to give some examples of each kind of effect, first of all, as many of your listeners probably know, factory farming and animal agriculture in general do contribute to global health and environmental threats, both directly and indirectly. For example, when you breed lots of animals in ways that give them weakened immune systems, and then you force them to live together in crowded, toxic environments, and then you pump them full of antibiotics and antimicrobials to stimulate growth and suppress the spread of disease, that creates the ideal breeding ground for novel antibiotic or antimicrobial resistant pathogens like novel variants of COVID-19 or bird flu. Similarly, when you then dump a lot of waste in the local land, it can seep into the land and water and air and harm workers and local community members. And the contaminated meat can then harm consumers and other people. And then, of course, it can contribute to outbreaks that can have global health effects. And similarly, indirectly, insofar as this food system requires a lot of land use and contributes to deforestation, deforestation can also make global health impacts worse because it reduces forested biodiversity, which can function as a buffer against the spread of infectious zoonotic diseases. And it also increases interactions between humans and wild animals who can be carriers for infectious zoonotic diseases. And all of the same issues are true with respect to environmental impacts, including climate change. For example, beef and dairy agriculture are major methane emitters. In general, animal agriculture is a major emitter of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, and is responsible for an estimated 14.5% of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, which is partly due to what happens on the farms, but is also, again, partly due to the land use requirements and contribution to deforestation, because, again, forests capture and store carbon dioxide under the ground. So when you knock them down, you release a bunch of stored carbon dioxide into the air and you diminish the planet's ability to capture and store carbon dioxide in the future. So in all of these ways, our treatment of animals in factory farming, deforestation, and the wildlife trade contribute to global health and environmental emergencies like pandemics and climate change. And then when these emergencies occur, they impact humans and non-humans alike, both directly and indirectly. For example, as we have seen, animals are impacted directly because when a disease outbreak occurs, animals can get sick and die too, right? Minks got sick with COVID-19 and they suffered and died because of COVID-19. So did other animals. And they can be harmed because of human violence and neglect. We might see them as pests or carriers and kill them for that reason. Or we might see them as excess inventory we can no longer use during supply chain breakdowns, and we might kill them for that reason. And all the same is true with climate change. In a world reshaped by climate change, when you have more frequent and intense extreme weather events like floods and fires and heat waves, those will kill animals directly by the billions when these weather emergencies occur, and will kill animals indirectly because, again, humans will harm them and kill them and neglect them at higher levels, at higher rates, because we see them as invasive species rather than climate refugees. And so we kill them to protect our economic interests, or because we are no longer able to care for them in the ways that we previously were. So in all of these ways, human and non-human fates are interconnected in the Anthropocene. What we do to them hurts them, it affects global health and environmental issues, and then those issues hurt us and them all over again. And so we need to improve our treatment of animals by including them as part of our pandemic and climate change mitigation efforts, reducing our use of them while we try to mitigate the effects of these threats, and increasing our support for them as part of our pandemic and climate change adaptation efforts, thinking about how we can create a world that can be more accommodating for them while we try to build more resilient and sustainable cities and food, energy, and transportation systems.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm really keen to get to some of these practical proposals that you make in the book a little bit later. But first, I wanted to ask about the underlying philosophy of your arguments, because you claim that we need to agree on a set of shared moral principles. And you introduce a fairly simple position that is intermediate between a rights theory approach to this and a consequentialist approach to this. So could you introduce us to this compromise?
Yes, absolutely. Especially when it comes to what we owe wild animals, but to some extent when it comes to what we owe all animals and humans. There is sometimes a divide between consequentialist and non-consequentialist approaches. And consequentialists think that morality is about consequences and we should do what has the best consequences. And non-consequentialists think morality is about more than consequences. It might be about respecting rights or cultivating virtuous characters or cultivating relationships of care. But either way, consequentialists think we should improve happiness in the world, and non-consequentialists think we should do other things too. And that can sometimes lead to tensions about what we owe wild animals, because consequentialists will say that if we have the opportunity to improve their lives, to allow them to experience more happiness and less suffering, we should do that. Whereas non-consequentialists say, no, not only do we not owe them that, but what we owe them is leaving them alone. we should leave them alone and respect their autonomy. That is what we owe them, right? So consequentialists think we should help them. Non-consequentialists think we should leave them alone. But part of what I note in the book is that in the Anthropocene, in a world reshaped by human activity, the line between natural and human caused suffering starts to blur. And so what we owe to wild animals, according to both consequentialist and non-consequentialist perspectives, starts to converge, because on one hand, non-consequentialists need to recognize that moving forward, human activity will be complicit in everything that happens to humans and non-humans alike all over the world. And so helping wild animals is no longer simply a matter of doing something nice for them. Helping them is now a matter of reducing and repairing the harms that we are already causing them. And that is an obligation that consequentialists and non-consequentialists alike agree that we have. But meanwhile, consequentialists need to appreciate that these issues are incredibly, yes, important, but also incredibly complicated and difficult. And there are significant limitations on our knowledge and power and political will. And so we need to moderate our expectations and aspirations. And we also need to recognize that the power that systems of rights and virtuous character traits and caring relationships and structures can have, and the way that they can empower us to improve our consequences in the world. And so what I argue is that because of our predicament in the Anthropocene, everybody, no matter what our starting point is, everybody should agree that we do have responsibilities to care for all animals, including wild animals now, but that we also need to only take on what we can achieve and sustain. And we also need to build robust systems of rights and cultivate virtuous characters and cultivate just and caring relationships and structures so that we can discharge those responsibilities. And so we should all converge on this kind of moderate, balanced, pluralistic view that we should help animals as much as reasonably possible while respecting their rights and cultivating and expressing virtue and care.
Now, I know you've encountered the challenge that this compromise position that you've just summarised for us is very demanding. You provide some very good arguments in the book against the claim that taking animals seriously is so demanding that we shouldn't take animals seriously. But there's a different kind of demandingness that we might talk about, and I think you were sort of alluding to it in what you just said. And that's that we might be able to take animals seriously, and especially wild animals, as you know, by leaving them alone rather than by aspiring them to help them as much as possible. So do you think that there might be a demandingness case in saying that right now we shouldn't be marching out into nature to help animals, and instead we should be leaving them alone as far as possible?
Yes, I do think that we should strike a balanced approach in that respect. But I do think that we should take ourselves to have a responsibility to care for wild animals right now. The way that I think about this is to accept that on one hand, these issues are really urgent and important, and we do have responsibilities to wild animals now. But on the other hand, these issues are also, as I said, really difficult and complicated, and we might not yet have the knowledge or power or political will that we need in order to help animals effectively and sustainably at scale. And so what we should be doing right now is undertaking work that can help at least some animals now while also helping humans, and that can allow us to build that knowledge and power and political will that we need towards more effective and sustainable interventions at scale later on. And so, for example, if we can find ways to include wild animal welfare in our climate change mitigation and adaptation policies now, by installing bird-friendly glass on new energy-efficient buildings and vehicles, or by installing overpasses or underpasses on new green transportation systems, if we can undertake those types of interventions now in ways that are good for humans and at least some wild animals at present and are achievable and are sustainable, if we can do that now, then we can learn more about how these changes affect wild animals over time. We can build more of a political infrastructure for considering the interests of animals in these policy decisions over time. And we can build more public interest in including animals in these discussions over time. And then we might find later on that we have the resources that we need in order to do more than we can do today. So I do not think that we should wait for some time in the future when we have the ability to help wild animals that we lack now, in part because helping them now in small ways is what will give us that ability later on. But nor do I think, as you say, that we should just try to help every wild animal in the world right now in a way that will clearly backfire. I think that we should strike a balance and do more and more over time, the more we learn and the more we build power and motivation.
You talk a lot about insects in this book. I think it's fair to say that you think insects are very important and they are not an issue or a group of animals that we should avoid in our moral, legal, and political thought. So why insects?
Well, I think that all sentient animals morally matter. And I think that some non-sentient animals might morally matter, depending on what moral framework you prefer. Moreover, I think that insects are at least potentially sentient, and that they also at least potentially have some other features that people take to morally matter, such as agency or consciousness itself. And my general view is that if someone might be sentient or otherwise morally significant, then we should take that possibility into account when deciding how to treat them, for the same reason that we should consider any kind of risk when deciding what to do. We all the time might avoid actions because they carry a small but non-negligible risk of harming someone against their will, right? I have a stance against driving drunk because I know that even if it might not definitely harm or kill someone, and it might not even probably harm or kill someone, there is nevertheless a small but non-negligible chance that it will harm someone. And that is a good enough reason for me to call an Uber or a Lyft or a friend or stay where I am and sober up before I get behind the wheel. And similarly, we might not know that insects are definitely sentient or even that they are probably sentient, but based on the information that we currently have, they have at least a small but non-negligible chance of being sentient, in the same kind of way that I should find a way to get home other than driving drunk if I can. We should, for example, find a way to get protein other than by farming trillions of insects per year if we can, in light of the small but non-negligible risk that that activity might be harming them. So when you consider the fact that they might matter based on what we currently know, and then you consider the fact that quintillions of them exist at any given time, and that we are currently harming trillions of them per year in insect farming, and quadrillions of them per year with agricultural insecticides and for other reasons, we should at the very least treat that as one factor among many in our decisions about what to do.
We should also mention that it's not just current animals that you're talking about here, but future animals as well. In fact, at one point you say our moral responsibilities to future humans and non-humans might outweigh our moral responsibilities to current humans and non-humans, all things considered. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, our current treatment of animals in factory farming, deforestation, wildlife trade, other industries, again, are contributing to these global health and environmental threats like pandemics and climate change. And then these global effects of our activities are going to shape what types of species can exist in the future, what types of individuals can exist in the future, and what types of lives they can have. And in the same kind of way that we have a responsibility to future generations of humans to think about what kind of planet we might be leaving them and what kinds of lives we might be allowing them to have, we should also think about what kind of planet we are leaving for other species and those individuals and what kinds of lives those individuals can have. And when we look far enough to the future, what we see is a world where our activity right now is indirectly responsible for the existence of everyone who exists, or nearly everyone who exists, as well as their quality of life. And we should take that into account. And that makes ethics really complicated, because once you start considering the interests and needs and vulnerabilities of all sentient or otherwise morally significant beings who might exist by our activity or otherwise be affected by our activity, once you take into account all of them, then you realize there are going to be winners and losers and trade-offs everywhere. For example, climate change might look clearly bad when all you think about is the impacts for humans, but it starts to have much more mixed effects once you consider the impacts for non-humans. Once the northern and southern parts of the planet get warmer, that will allow some insect and parasite populations to expand north and south and increase in their numbers. And if they have good lives that are worth living, that will be a benefit of climate change. Similarly, jellyfishes are going to thrive in the oceans produced by human activity and human-caused climate change. And if we want to do ethics well, we need to consider those benefits for animals as well as the various harms for animals that will occur as a result of our activities. Now, I still think that factory farming, deforestation, the wildlife trade, and the resulting threats like pandemics and climate change are bad, all things considered, and that we should work to mitigate them and adapt to them. But we should do that while keeping in mind that everything we do is going to produce winners and losers, and we should always be thinking about what we can do to not only increase the amount of winners that our actions produce, but also to mitigate harms for the losers. And that includes not only humans and non-humans who exist at present, but also humans and non-humans who are going to exist in the future.
Do you think this is a pessimistic picture?
Not at all. I think that this is a realistic picture. My theory and my analysis of the empirical evidence shows that our current situation is a predicament. We have the power to do a lot of good, but we also have the power to do a lot of harm. And the decisions that we make right now are going to determine to what extent we do good or harm moving forward. We are currently on a track of causing more and more harm each year because we are expanding these industries like factory farming and deforestation and the wildlife trade. We are harming and killing more animals per year completely unnecessarily because we do have access to alternative ways of making ends meet and feeding ourselves. But we also have the power to build our way out of this predicament. We have the power to invest in these alternatives to these industries. We have the power to reform our social and legal and political systems so that they are less racist and sexist and ageist and ableist and speciesist. And we are showing signs of moving in that direction in fits and starts. So is it a pessimistic picture? No, I think that there could be a positive, wonderful future where humans and non-humans coexist, if not perfectly harmoniously, then at least much more harmoniously than we do now. And I feel really energized about doing whatever I can and supporting our field and our movement and doing whatever we can to make that future a reality. But that future is precarious. It is not destined to happen. Whether it happens is going to depend in part on what we do right now, which is why we should be working so hard to produce the better future instead of the worse future.
Well, so let's address that question directly. What are the practical upshots of your argument? You've mentioned factory farming, deforestation, wildlife trade. They're three kind of recurring features throughout the book and indeed our conversation. Are they things that we should be banning right now? Are they things that we should be working towards banning? Are they things that we could ban?
I do believe that we can and should eventually ban them, and that we can pursue local, small scale, partial bans in the short term as partial means to that end in the medium term or in the long run. Yeah, in general, I think that there are a bunch of policies that we can and should be pursuing right now. For example, we can and should be pursuing reforms to these industries in a variety of ways. Governments, for example, can use informational policies in order to share information, educate the public about the impacts of these industries and the availability of alternatives. They can be using financial policies to support good systems and not support bad systems. For example, by using procurement policies to purchase plant-based foods instead of animal-based foods, by using subsidies to support plant-based foods instead of animal-based foods, by using taxes and full cost pricing to make sure harmful industries pay for the harms that they cause instead of using public money to pay for the harms that they cause. And they can also be using regulations to limit or ban the worst practices within these industries and make sure that they can treat workers and animals and public health and the environment minimally decently. And if they do all of that at the same time, the cost of harmful products will naturally go up and the cost of less harmful products will naturally go down, and then public support for harmful products will naturally go down, and public support for less harmful products will naturally go up. So we can be doing all of that now. And then in the meantime, we can also be conducting and supporting research and advocacy around these issues so that we can learn more and have more public support for example, including wild animal welfare in our impact assessments and policy decisions. And then we can indeed include, for example, wild animal welfare in our impact assessments and policy decisions in a range of domains. We can include them in education and employment policy by making sure that we fund education for the ways in which our treatment of animals affects them and affects us. And we can create employment opportunities once we need to transition from our current food and energy and transportation systems to new, more resilient and sustainable ones. We can have a just transition for workers and consumers who currently depend on the bad systems. We can create jobs and other opportunities for them as part of the good systems. And I think in many ways, most importantly, once we start building new infrastructure, when we need to build more resilient and sustainable infrastructure in order to cope with climate change, then we also have an opportunity to ask, how can that infrastructure be more accommodating of the animals who will need to coexist with us? And I mentioned examples before. Bird-friendly glass is one, wildlife corridors is another, but there are so many other things that we can do as well to reduce non-human need and human-non-human conflict in shared environments. And we should be looking at infrastructure policy as a way of doing that. And finally, and more fundamentally, we can stop harming and killing animals as a first resort whenever we have any kind of perceived conflict. Right now, we really do kill them anytime they seem to be encroaching on our interests. But if we build the right types of structures, then we will have more nonviolent options available to us, and we can address conflicts in nonviolent ways and stop blaming them and harming them and killing them whenever a conflict arises. And finally, and ultimately, we also need to be re-examining their basic legal and political and economic status. Part of why change is so hard right now is that they currently have the legal and political and economic status of objects, property, commodities. And so in order to facilitate the kinds of changes I was just describing and then build on them, we will also need to create new types of legal and political and economic statuses that they can have as subjects, as persons, and as the types of beings who can, for instance, own property rather than be owned as property. But those will be more fundamental changes that might take longer for us to achieve.
Yes, I'm glad you finished with that question of the fundamental changes, because this book is a very political book. In places, it seems to veer away from moral philosophy, which is where I would normally associate your work, much more towards political philosophy or legal philosophy. So, when you're thinking about reassessing the status of animals, we've got to also think about reassessing the status of our states and our communities and the way we order ourselves. So, do you think that a state or a community that took the kind of principles you're advocating here fully seriously, do you think that's compatible with, say, liberal democracy? Or is it going to move more towards an anarchistic system or a socialistic system? Where do you see this going?
That is a great question, and one that I gesture at without fully answering in the book, because that, of course, requires many more books to address. Right now, I think the jury is out about whether a just multi species society would look like liberal democratic capitalism or some alternative to liberal democratic capitalism, because this is in part a really complicated empirical question about which system in practice is going to do the most good and the least harm. And right now we can speculate about that, we can theorize about that, but ultimately we need to see how systems develop and how systems work. And we should avoid the temptation of comparing a clearly deeply imperfect status quo with our imagined utopian alternative. We need to compare the deeply imperfect version of the current systems that exist with the deeply imperfect versions of alternate systems that would exist. And so I am very interested in having a field of animal studies, for example, and broader related academic fields that both explore what can be done to create a more just multi-species society within the constraints of liberalism, democracy, and capitalism, as well as exploring what types of alternatives can be imagined, what the risks and benefits of these alternatives would be, and what opportunities there would be for creating multi-species justice there too, and then exploring and experimenting and learning as we go.
Now, Jeff, you've appeared multiple times on Knowing Animals before, so I've had to dust off something which doesn't get an airing very often, which is our 3 quick questions. So are you ready for your 3 quick questions?
Let's go for it, yeah.
So you've been involved in the field of animal studies for quite a while. How do you see the field developing? Where do you think it's going? What exciting prospects do you see on the horizon?
I think this is a really exciting time for animal studies. This field has, of course, existed in some sense for decades, but has had an increasingly institutional presence over the past decade or so. There are now many animal studies programs at colleges and universities all over the world, and many more are appearing each year. And so we need to keep building on that momentum. And one recent trend that I am especially excited about is the emergence of animal law programs at colleges and universities. We now, for example, have quite prominent animal law programs at Lewis and Clark, Harvard, Yale, Vermont, other places, and that will continue. And I think that is going to be very important, really making animals more visible, more salient, more credible as a topic of interest in law and policy. And that can happen by making animal law as a field more credible and legitimate.
If you were to offer one piece of advice to an emerging animal studies scholar, what would it be?
Well, animal studies is still expanding as a field, and there are more programs, but there are not yet enough programs. And for that reason, I think it does help to, while situating yourself as an animal studies scholar, also situate yourself as a scholar in some related field. For instance, I came up as a philosopher, and so my training was in foundational issues in philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, ethics. And I then brought that to bear on my interest in animals over time in my career. And while I now do a lot of multidisciplinary work and am now more of a generalist, I think that my work has benefited from my having that really solid, rigorous grounding in philosophy. And so both out of practical necessity and because I think it benefits the work, I would advise newcomers to the field of animal studies to think about what field in the humanities, social sciences, or natural sciences you can develop a certain methodological and substantive expertise and use that to make your own distinctive contribution to our field.
Yes, I agree entirely. If you had a year off from all of your other university responsibilities and were able to undertake any animal-related research project without any limitations, what would you do?
Well, I do have a lot of projects related to animals that I plan to undertake when I have time. But since you have asked me a question about what I would do if I had no limitations, I would do a global census of animals. I would create a vast team of researchers to go all over the planet and in the oceans and underneath the planet and figure out exactly how many species there are, exactly how many individuals exist within these species, and exactly how human activity is impacting them in each region. We need a global accounting of who exists, of who we share this planet with, and in what numbers and in what ways they exist, and in what numbers and in what ways our actions are affecting them. So I would conduct that global census, and I would go beyond that too, and really try to learn more about all of them, and what their brains are like, and what their behaviors are like, and so on. So that is what I would do without limitations. With limitations, of course, I would embark on other projects, but that is what I think we really need if we can come up with it or approximate it.
What are you working on next?
Well, right now we are launching a couple of new programs at NYU this year. One, as you noted, is the Mind, Ethics, and Policy program, which is about what kinds of non-humans can be sentient and what types of moral and legal and political status they should have. And that includes not only animals like insects, but also artificial intelligences. And the other is the Wild Animal Welfare program, which is about what wild animals are like and how humans and wild animals interact and how humans can improve our interactions with wild animals at scale. And so I am currently conducting and supporting research as part of both of those programs, and trying to drive work around both of those issues. And the one project I will note is that my current book in contract with W.W. Norton is called The Moral Circle, and is all about the moral status of insects and artificial intelligences. And it makes the kind of argument that I was sketching before, that I think we should extend moral status not only to everyone who is sentient or otherwise morally significant, but also to everyone who has at least a non-negligible chance of being sentient or otherwise morally significant, as far as we can tell. And I think that insects and near future artificial intelligences have a chance of being sentient or otherwise morally significant, as far as we can tell. And so we need to extend them at least some moral consideration, and that will be utterly transformative. So that is what the next book is about.
How can people find out more about your work?
You can find me on Facebook and Twitter. My website is jeffsebo.net, pretty easy to find on Google. Feel free to be in touch if you have interest in my work or in these issues, or if you want to share your work with me. I love hearing from people in the field and movement, and I would love to hear from some of your listeners.
Well, thanks so much, Jeff, for joining us for this podcast.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. I really appreciate it. Great talking with you.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn, or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Please do spread the word about Knowing Animals, and if you're teaching, consider putting some episodes of Knowing Animals on your reading lists. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.